Hello, I'm Jeff Lehmkuhler, Extension Beef Cattle Specialist at the University of Kentucky, and I want to thank the Planning Committee for asking me to share with you a little bit about you got a forage test and now what. And so we'll spend a little bit of time here going through what we can do with a forage test. Before we get into that, I want to just mention that when we think about our feeding program, it really is a balancing act. As we look at a seesaw or a teeter-totter here example, we've got nutrient supply on the left-hand side, and that's going to be involving nutrient concentration or how much is in a feedstuff, the digestibility of the feedstuff to release those nutrients, and then obviously intake level of a given feed. And then on the right-hand side, kind of balancing out the teeter-totter or the seesaw here is the nutrient requirements of the animals themselves. Think about the net energy system for beef cows. We have maintenance requirement needs to support current tissue body mass and normal body functions for the animal. We have then conceptus growth, which would be kind of the requirements for reproduction. And then obviously if the cow's lactating, the more milk she's producing, the more energy and protein is going to be required to support that level of milk production. We haven't talked about game. We're going to predominantly focus on beef cows today, but obviously we wanted to think about growing calves in. We wouldn't be dealing with reproduction and lactation. We would be looking at tissue accretion and the differences between a calf gaining 1 pound versus maybe a calf gaining 2 or 3 pounds per day. So when we want to start this process of thinking about looking at this balancing act in the feeding program, one of the first places to start is to estimate the nutrient supply. And nutrient supply is going to involve obviously intake, like we already discussed, nutrient concentration, and that's going to be determined by a forage test. And then the digestibility of a feedstuff, and then absorption of those nutrients from the gastrointestinal tract. Our forage test provides us with that level of nutrient concentration like we already discussed, and in some instances we may get predictions for digestibility of certain components within the feed, and particularly when we're looking at the fiber component to give us an idea how much energy we may get out of a forage. But when we're trying to estimate intake, we can get some components from a forage test that can be useful to help us predict what intake of a given forage may be, particularly looking at different qualities, low versus high quality forages. And the first and kind of the easiest approach would be to use neutral detergent fiber, or NDF. Some of the forage tests may list them as ANDF, and A just stands for amylase, so that there's no starch contaminating the cell wall components. And that equation then is dry matter intake as a percent of body weight equal to a constant factor of 120 divided by the NDF value within the given forage that we might be looking at. And so here's an example. If we run through the equation here using a hay that had a NDF value of 62, 120 divided by 62 gives us 1.9%. And so we take that a little further on a 1,300 pound cow. We take 1.9% and convert it back to the decimal form by dividing by 100. We come up with an estimated forage intake of 25 pounds of dry matter. So net energy for maintenance can be used to estimate intake for pregnant dry cows, and this is what NASM uses. And here's the equation. You can see the net energy for maintenance in megacows per day is given by this equation here. All these units are in metric, so if you try to use this for yourself, be sure to convert body weight to kilograms, and then most of your forage test values are going to have megacows per pound, and you'll have to convert that to megacows per kilogram. And if we go through an example with a 1,300 pound cow with a hay that had a 58% TDN, we go through that first process of converting body weight into metabolic body weight and following through the known concentration of NEM for the hay. We come up with a net energy for maintenance intake prediction of 14.6 megacows per day. Now that doesn't do us a lot of good, and we need to convert that back out into meaningful information for you, which would be pounds per day. And so in this example, the hay would contain 1.23 megacows per kilogram. And so when we divide 14.6 megacows by the concentration of energy which is 1.23 megacows per kilogram. That gives us an estimate of 11.9 kilograms, or multiply that by 2.2 to come up with 26 pounds per day. Very close. And one thing to keep in the back of our mind is that the net energy for prediction equation here is for cows that are pregnant and dry. And the NASM does say that for lactating cows, we would need to make an increase based on the level of milk production for intake. And so we won't go through that for a time today, but just realize that this is kind of the baseline prediction. Now, there are some things to keep in the back of our mind for intake and trying to estimate what that might be. And even with the wealth of knowledge that we have today, we figure that we can account for about 70% of the variation in intake. So there are factors that we have to consider, such as anti-nutritional factors like alkaloids, and one of our common ones that we would be familiar with would be the ergot alkaloids. But there are other alkaloids and other forages that can have a detrimental impact on intake. We have the potential for mold and mycotoxins to have a reduction on forage intake. And then one we don't often think about is actually nutrient deficiencies. And in this example I'm using is degradable intake protein. And so if we have a shortage of degradable intake protein, the microbes won't be as productive, and they won't be able to replicate as quickly and break down forages in the rumen as fast, and that will have a detrimental impact on forage intake. And then lastly, environment. One of the things we have to keep in the back of our mind is that really muddy conditions can limit the desire for cattle to move freely towards feed, and particularly if we're dealing with muddy hay rings in the wintertime, that the environment itself can play a negative role on forage intake. So given these factors, if you're considering looking at nutrient requirement tables that we're going to talk about here in a minute to try and estimate forage intake, take a little bit of time to actually visually inspect the forage and see how mature the forage may be. Is it stemmy? Is there seed heads in it? And so in this particular example, you can see this hay sample's got quite a few stems in it. There's some foxtail seed heads in here that would give us an indication that this was cut in late summer. But the stem to leaf ratio here is quite high for stems and not so high for leaves, which would give us an indication of a relatively mature forage that's going to have lower digestibility. Are there weeds present? And an example would be like ironweed that's not going to be very palatable, and so they may reduce intake of that. And if you're trying to force them to eat that, then that's going to have a detrimental impact on voluntary intake as well. Is there mold present, and does it have a kind of a musty smell to it that may have a detrimental impact on intake? All these things you can do real quickly by just pulling out some hay and looking at it and getting a rough idea of whether or not you may need to make some adjustments on intake predictions from the nutrient requirement tables that we're going to talk about. NASM that I referred to earlier stands for the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. They publish the current nutrient requirements of beef cattle publication. Formerly it was the National Research Council, and we referred to it as the NRC. But basically, committees go through the scientific literature and then make recommendations for nutrient requirement levels for beef cattle. And this publication is the basis for developing feed programs. Nutritionists may refer to it as the Nutritionist Bible, because it really is the foundation of developing feeding programs. But then as a nutritionist, we often have to take the recommendations to fit different scenarios and different management situations that we may be dealing with, and make slight adjustments here and there based on what we see in the field. And I just wanted to share with you some nutrient requirement tables and what they may look like. And you can find these by doing a Google search on the internet. Oftentimes there are extension publications that are accessible. You can also run computer models to generate nutrient requirement tables. And most of the tables are going to be based on the stage of production. And so this is an example table here. We have a 1,300 pound mature cow weight with a peak estimate of 20 pounds of milk. As is the case with most of these tables, on the left-hand side, you're going to have months since calving for our cow tables anyways. You're going to have months since calving. In this example, we're going 1 through 6 months. And it's going to reflect the differences in milk production. Most of our beef cows will peak out somewhere between 6 and 9 weeks, and the NASM model assumes 8.5 weeks for milk production. So here what we're saying is that within the second month since calving, cows are going to reach peak, and they're going to have that peak at 20 pounds, which is indicated here in the table. Now, another column, we have body weight. And so you can see that body weight remains constant for the first 2 months, and then it begins to increase as the conceptus or the fetus begins to grow, and you've got more tissue there for the reproductive tract. Dry matter intake is often given in these tables, and this is important, particularly given the discussion we had earlier about making adjustments based on anti-nutritional factors such as mold and alkaloids that may be present. These tables are giving you assumed values for nutrient requirements based off of these assumed intakes. It's particularly important to understand that with 16 pounds of TDN required at 28 pounds of dry matter intake, if a cow is only consuming 20 pounds of dry matter, then they still have to achieve close to 16 pounds of TDN. The concentration of energy will be higher, or will need to be higher in that forage. So as you move down the lactation curve, you can see that the energy and crude protein values for requirements tend to follow the level of milk production. Now, I just want to reiterate that livestock have nutrient requirements based on quantities. In other words, in this table, we're showing pounds per day. They don't go out and consume percentages. We talk about percentages often because it's easier when we're talking about a forage test that has crude protein or TDN listed as a percentage. But understand and appreciate that those percentages are going to be based off of the dry matter intake assumed and meeting the actual quantity of nutrient needed. A few cautions about using the published tables that you may find on the internet is that most don't account for breed differences, and NASM recommendations do give some discussion in there about making adjustments for breeds. The maintenance requirement, for example, will differ by breeds, where Bos indicus influenced livestock will have a lower maintenance requirement than our continental and British cattle. And so in this example, I'm just showing you that Brayfords would have about a 5% less or 5% lower maintenance requirement than Angus. Then also, there's going to be differences for breeds based on their genetic potential for milk production. And so the NASM table has Simmental cattle in at a peak milk production of 26 pounds on average, compared to Angus, who have a peak production of only 18. And so again, as you understand, milk production increases the nutrient needs. If we have two different breeds, it's important to understand that the models themselves that are generating these tables are taking into account the genetic differences that may have been in there 20 years ago. And so the genetic trend for breeds needs to make or be considered when making some adjustment to the nutrient requirements for livestock. But the tables themselves are using these types of values as an example to generate the nutrient requirements in those tables. Now, also, many of the tables are only going to give you nutrients based on a percentage concentration. In other words, 10% crude protein, 54% TDN, and not give you the pounds of TDN or the pounds of protein or the grams of or milligrams of a mineral. I mentioned this already, but it's really important to reiterate. These are based on assumed dry matter intakes, and so you have to understand or appreciate that your concentrations may be higher or lower depending on what type of forage intake you may be getting. And this is our biggest challenge, is not knowing exactly what intakes are going to be on given farms. And so we really are approaching it with best guesstimates. And then lastly, there's the assumption that there's no environmental stress, no cold stress, no heat stress. We're not dealing with wet hides and mud, and we're not dealing with 95-degree temperatures and 60% relative humidities. The tables generate the nutrient requirements at thermal neutral conditions. Now, the third step is trying to take and look at the balance between the forage nutrient supplies and the animal nutrient requirements. and evaluate different feeding programs. And we utilize forage test values to get the nutrient concentrations, and we can plug those into a tool like this, which is the UK Beef Cow Forage Supplement Tool. And we would use our forage test information to enter in these values. And then we would try to predict the intake, like we talked about, using maybe NDF or the net energy concentration of the forage, and then balance out the ration. And so I'm going to go through as a quick example of what a forage test may look like. This is from a stockpile of grass out of the Little Research Farm this fall. And so when we look at these values, it's important to kind of keep in the back of our mind that the nutrient requirements for cattle are based on a dry matter basis. And so if we want to use a table of nutrient requirements and compare a forage and how well the forage matches up to the requirements, we want to use dry matter values, not as received or as fed values, because the moisture is diluting down the concentration of the nutrients. It's also important to understand that we're not making adjustments in these values for digestibility. These are actual just concentration values within a feedstuff. And so we can do a really quick evaluation of forages and whether or not they're going to meet the nutrient requirements of cattle at different stages of production by comparing our forage test results. And here's our forage test again that I brought over from the last page of 60.8 TDN, 11.6% crude protein. And here's a different nutrient requirement table for a mature cow with a peak weight of 1,300 pounds and a peak of milk, or a peak milk production of 25 pounds. And they've broken it down in the stage of production: early lactation, mid-lactation, mid-gestation, and late gestation, as well as giving you the corresponding months since calving. And so if we quickly want to see how this forage does, we can see that we're going to be short on energy here in the second and third month post-calving when milk production is at its highest. And so we're going to be short in calories or energy because the TDN value is lower than what that requirement is at these 2 months. However, that forage would be sufficient for mid and late lactation. It would be fine for mid and late gestation as well. And in all reality, this forage would basically meet the protein requirements, and so protein supplementation would not necessarily be needed if this was the forage that we had available to us. And so really we would be looking at maybe energy supplementation during the second and third month post-calving if we were dealing maybe with fall calving cows and we're having to feed this hay. And then lastly, step 4 is to develop a supplement strategy. And our primary goal in a supplement program should be to meet the nutritional requirements to achieve that level of production that's desired in the operation. And then secondly, we want to do that the most cost effectively. It is not the other way around where we feed the cows as cheap as we possibly can and hope that we meet the nutritional needs. Primary goal is to meet the nutritional needs as cost effectively as possible. And when we're designing supplement programs, we want to consider the cost and then also how are we going to be able to handle and deliver the feedstuffs. Some of us may be set up to be able to handle liquid feeds like stillage and syrup, but the rest of us may not be able to, and we may need to use buckets like the photo shows and feed the cows maybe every day or even every other day or twice a week. And so we can develop strategic supplement programs. And there's an approach as an example. Let's assume that the forage supplies 12.5 megacows of energy a day. We've taken the nutrient concentration, got an estimate of intake, and this is what we come up with a supply. We looked up in a nutrient requirement table and found out that the cows actually required 14 megacows per day. So we're deficient 1.5 megacows. We could use a feedstuff table and look up different feeds and supplements that we may be able to purchase. And so in this example, we'll assume we're going to use soybean hulls, and they have a concentration of 0.82 megacows per pound of dry matter. In order to determine how much soy hulls is needed, it's just very simple. We take the deficiency of 1.5 megacows and divide it by the concentration of energy in the supplement, and soy hulls in this example is 0.82. And so we end up coming up and finding out that we need 1.8 pounds of soy hulls on a dry matter basis. And we know that soy hulls have about 10% moisture, so we correct that to determine the as fed by dividing by 0.9 or 90% dry matter to come up with 2 pounds of soy hulls needed per day to provide that 1.5 megacals of energy to overcome that deficiency. And so computer programs today are how most of us are going to take and approach this. But for something very simple like this, using the tables, we can really quickly come up with some rough estimates on what the nutritional supplement program may need to be. And then lastly, I just want to say that forage testing really is a key on really balancing this forage supply versus nutrient needs. And the test provides us really with that foundational information because it gives us an idea to be able to predict what the nutrient supply is going to be. And it's important that we understand that we want to just not look at crude protein. And I've plotted crude protein and TDN for about 400 forage samples taken this year from the Eastern Kentucky Hay Contest. And what I did is for a given level at 7.8% crude protein here, I've looked at the energy values from the lowest value at 48.8% TDN to the highest value, which was 57.7% TDN. In other words, these forages contain the exact same amount of crude protein, but yet drastically different energy values. And so often we think about the best feed has the highest crude protein, but there is significant variation in energy content of forages at the same crude protein level. So go beyond looking at crude protein and particularly pay attention to your energy content of your forages. And then lastly, the old saying is still true that the eye of the master fattens the beast. And so be sure to monitor your cows for body condition score and make adjustments to your supplement and feeding programs to maintain the desired body condition to optimize the performance that you want to see in your cows. With that, I want to thank you, and I hope we touched on a few things that might be useful for you this evening and provide you with some general information on why you would want to forage test and how we can use that forage test to develop strategic supplement programs to optimize your production on your farm and do that while meeting the nutritional requirements of the cows as cost effectively as we can. For more information, feel free to contact your county extension office and talk to your ag agent, or you can reach me at the email address there, or you can call and leave a message on my phone if I'm out of the office. Thank you again. If you have questions, feel free to reach out.